Hello. Thank you for choosing to watch this Epilepsy WA presentation entitled Epilepsy and Memory. Let's go again. Hello. Thank you for choosing to watch this Epilepsy WA presentation titled Epilepsy and Memory, How to Hold That Thought. My name is Lauren Buckles and I'm the Community Coordinator here at Epilepsy WA, and it is my pleasure to present this seminar to you today. Thanks must go to UCB for their ongoing support that enables us to share with you these online seminars. One of the most common issues that is addressed both in our support groups and during telephone inquiries to EWA is that of memory. At some point, of course, we've all forgotten where we parked the car, where we put the car keys, or why we even walked into a room in the first place. But for people with epilepsy, memory lapses are far more common. Let's start again. Hello. Thank you for choosing to watch this Epilepsy WA presentation entitled Epilepsy and Memory, How to Hold That Thought. My name is Lauren Buckles and I'm the Community Coordinator here at EWA, and it is my pleasure to share this seminar with you today. One of the most common issues that is addressed in our support groups and also during telephone inquiries here to Epilepsy WA is that of issues with memory. At some point, of course, we've all forgotten where we parked our car, where we put our car keys, or even why we walked into a room. But for people with epilepsy, memory lapses are more common and can be more pressing. In this presentation, we want to explore memory, what it is, how it works, what specific impact epilepsy might have on memory and our ability to recall information, provide you with some tips on improving your memory in general, as well as exploring some strategies to compensate for ongoing issues with memory. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. So let's get started. So what is memory? Memory is our ability to encode, store, retain, and then recall information and past experiences. So how does it work? There are actually 3 stages to the process of committing something to memory. The first step is known as encoding. So this is the learning component where we take on new information. It's the act of getting that information into our memory systems, either deliberately, such as when we're studying for an exam or have something really important to remember, or automatically. Once we've encoded the information, the next step is storage. So this involves moving that information into the short or long-term memory in preparation for retrieval. So again, there are 3 key ways which we enable the storage. The first is known as maintenance rehearsal. This is the repeating of information often enough to almost force that information into storage. The classic example of this is that rote learning that I'm sure we all did when it came time for exams at either school or university. That constant repetition, reading and repeating the information until we felt it was sort of safely secured in our long-term memory. The second way we store information is through elaborate rehearsal. So this is associating the new information with other meaningful information we already have stored. Now, a really good example of this is the tune Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, which I'm sure you all know. But had you noticed that the tune that children use to learn their alphabet, the A, B, C, D, E, F, G, is actually the same tune as Twinkle Twinkle Little Star? Now, what's happening here is that we're taking the tune of possibly one of the earliest songs that we learnt right from our infancy, and then we're actually combining that with new information, being the 26 letters of the alphabet, so that when it's time for children to learn the alphabet, those letters are becoming associated with something that's already firmly implanted in that long-term memory, therefore making it easier for that new information to be logged away also. And the last way we enable the storage is through what's known as distinct encoding. So this is separating the new information from other learnt information. This is usually done through an impactful event. So for example, many of us will remember where we were when we heard about 9/11. I know I can certainly recall where I was at the exact moment I heard that Princess Diana had died. But of course the same applies for positive information. So let's say you receive a phone call that tells you that you've won a grand lottery and won a new home. You're of course going to be able to remember it in quite clear, crystal clear detail for years to come where you were when you heard that news. So once we've encoded and then stored the information, we need to look at, obviously the whole point is to get it back, so retrieval. The process of taking the information out of storage and then into our conscious awareness. And again, things happen in threes in this presentation. There are 3 ways that we retrieve information. Firstly is recall, so we come up with the information we want immediately and without any issue at all. Secondly, we can use what's known as cue-dependent recall. So this is recalling the information when we're offered a prompt. So for example, if you need to remember someone's name but it's not coming to you, if you run through the letters of the alphabet, when you get to the alphabet letter that applies, chances are that'll jog your memory and you'll be able to bring that memory out of storage and into the forefront of your mind. The third step or type of retrieval is known as recognition. So we can't remember at the first point, but when we see the item that we want on a list, we're able to identify it quickly and easily. So if we look at that, I guess, in a visual way, one of the most useful models developed of memory was by Atkinson and Shiffrin in 1968, and it's known as the multi-store mode model of memory. So it sees memory almost as a linear process, I guess. So it starts in that we take information in from our environment, and then we move into one of the 3 different types of memory. So the information comes in straight away into our sensory memory. So this is momentary storage. It lasts for such a short period of time that it can almost be considered to be part of the process of perception. So almost simply a recognition of stimulus. And this is entirely out of our conscious control. So it has a very large capacity, very often is about that sensory information. And it's designed, the brain is designed to let much of the sensory information pass by without our notice. So it filters out information, only leaving behind that may be useful at a later date. I guess an example might be that sitting in your chair, if you put your mind to it, can all of a sudden become aware of what your clothes feel like on your skin. You could feel where your bottom is connecting with the chair. But unless you're actually drawing direct attention to that, that's going largely unnoticed because it's been filtered out by your brain because it's not considered pertinent information. Okay, so information comes into the sensory memory. It's either then forgotten or it is then transferred into our short-term memory, which is also known as our working memory. So this is the process of encoding the information. This is where the encoding takes place. This is a conscious process, but it's limited capacity. So we can hold and use around 7 pieces of information in our working memory, and it'll stay in our mind for 20 to 30 seconds to be analysed. If it's not used, however, it's quickly forgotten and lost. In this process, this is usually where potential errors occur and our memory can become distorted. So it's either going to be booted out if it's not relevant, or once again, that information will then be transferred into what's known as our long-term memory. So as you can see here, there's unlimited capacity in our long-term memory. So this is the information that has been processed and stored from our short-term or working memory. Now, memories can stay, long-term memory doesn't necessarily mean years. That may even be simply hours. But the activation of the information is triggered. So once it's in there, it's then triggered by recognition and processes to enable deliberate recall. So when it's not in use, as you can see here, it's organised, indexed and stored away out of our consciousness. So you can sort of see in this model here, they then say that the information's here, then it's either transferred back to our short memory and retrieved or what have you. So, but this is the process that information moves through. So what do we find embedded in our long-term memory? I guess there's 2 ways that the information can be incorporated and stored within. So we have what's known as implicit knowledge. So this is how to do something. So this is about learning skills at an unconscious level. So these tasks often require a lot of work to learn, but once they're learnt, they're rarely forgotten. So your classic example is riding a bike, or as I'm saying here, the ability to drive, hit a golf ball, or serving a tennis ball. Very often things that we can do without a great deal of conscious thought. So that's our implicit information or implicit memory. And then we have the explicit. This is knowing that. These are our facts and figures. So this includes remembering to get something done in the future. So the to-do list, the birthdays, memories of knowledge and facts about people, places or things, and remembering memories of events and experiences in our own lives. They're all considered explicit. Okay, so we talked before about memory being discarded or jettisoned if it's not useful, but we also mentioned that long-term memory can be a matter of hours. So it's really important to consider what is forgetting, because we all forget. So forgetting is simply the inability to recall information that we previously learned or committed to memory. Now, a lovely model here that you can see before you was developed in 1885 by Hermann Ebbinghaus, developing a theory to help us understand how long we actually retained information for. So he discovered that the rate of forgetting is fastest just after learning, and you can see that here with this curve, that the fastest drop-off occurs here between immediate learning and 20 minutes later. We lose almost half. And this forgetting then continues to decrease over time. So it's almost like a classic bell curve. So he's created what he calls the forgetting curve, and you'll see here that 31 days after we initially learnt the information, round about only 21% of what we had learnt remains in our long-term memory and accessible for us. Ebbinghaus also determined that retention success was dependent on time and the unique strength of memory of each individual. So it's an individual thing. So it's not just there are some who are better or have stronger memory capacity than others. So he discovered that the best way to increase the likelihood of retention was twofold. So repetition, which we talked about earlier with rote learning. If you repeat it, you're more likely to remember it and reduce the likelihood of forgetting. And secondly, the quality of memory presentation. So this means that the more relevant and meaningful the connections the new information makes in our mind with the things we already know, then again, the better our ability to retain it. So what does this tell us? I mean, we all naturally forget, and to retain information takes some effort on our behalf. If you do forget something, it's really important not to be too harsh on yourself, because it happens to everybody. So what I want us to think about now, we've sort of understand the concept of the process, which is encoding, storing, and recalling memory. And we have an idea of the components within that, how information moves from the sensory to the short-term to the long-term memory in preparation for recall. But there are some key factors that can impact on our ability to take on board and recall information. And these are standard for everybody. So the first one is attention and awareness. And certainly a lack of both will result in errors when it comes to encoding the information. For example, when you're listening to this and watching this presentation, ask yourself the question, am I focused on what is being said? And am I aware that important information is being presented to me? If the answer to either or both of these is no, then there is clearly going to be an issue if you're asked to recall the information at a later stage. But no, you can rest assured a test does not follow at the end. So ideally what this is telling us is that to remember something, you have to be present and you have to be paying attention. The next factor that can impact on this transition of information in our memory is the amount of information being presented and how complex or challenging it is. As we tire or if we become bored or stressed, our ability to take on board new information is impaired. And I'm sure you've all been in those work meetings that drag on for what seems like an eternity. And throughout that process, we become more occupied with remaining awake than actually paying attention to what's being discussed. If there's too much information, we find it incredibly difficult to focus. And the more complex and detailed the data, the more challenging it is to retain, which makes sense. It's much easier to remember, let's say, a 2-digit number than it is to remember a 6-digit number. The next factor is the speed of the information and the duration. So how quickly are you expected to hear and take on that information, and how long, and the duration, so how long are you being sort of forced to endure the process of being presented the information. So the faster it is, the less likely we are to recall it. We can only grasp a certain amount at one time, so much of it will be lost if the speed or delivery is too rapid. If you remember, they suggested in our short-term memory that only up to around 7 pieces of information can be dealt with at a time. So that's if we then are presented, however, with say 30 pieces of information in 30 seconds, there's a huge chunk there that we're not even going to be able to think about taking on board. And the longer we're required to listen, we come up against factors like fatigue, lack of motivation, and lack of interest. So there's a fine line, clearly, to optimise the amount of information being presented to maximise memory. Our next factor is that of personality and motivation. So by personality, it's about thinking about who you are and thinking about you in general. So are you naturally curious? Do you often lack interest in things that don't interest you? Do you have a short attention span? Are you easily distractible? And these are the traits that I'm referring to, so your natural state of being. If you are the kind of person who's easily distracted, then of course it's going to be a little more difficult and going to take a little more effort for you to sit still and focus long enough to retain important information. It's also important to recognise that if we don't consider the information important or relevant, then we're far less likely to attend long enough to retain it. So I assume that by watching this presentation, you do want to learn more about how to improve your memory or strategies to assist in recalling and retaining information. If you didn't, I'm quite sure you wouldn't sit with me through this whole process because it would lack information, it would lack interest, and you wouldn't be taking on board the information. And our last factor is that of mood and lifestyle. Our mood has a huge impact on how well we remember things. High and low mood states both can impair our ability to recall information. So initially interfering with the process of recognising information being presented, or by impeding the storage process. And lifestyle factors like lack of sleep is a classic example, or the influence of alcohol and drugs also interfere with memory by impacting on our ability to focus on the information being presented. So these are just the general things that get in the way. And some of these things are outside of our control, and to manage all of these things requires effort. So it's not really a surprise that memory can sometimes be a bit of an issue for everybody. Okay, but let's turn our focus now to how epilepsy specifically can impact on memory. I mean, the reason for memory issues in people with epilepsy differs from person to person, but I want to take you through some of the more common reasons. So let's start with seizures. Any type of seizure can affect someone's memory, and the more often they occur, the more likely it is that a person will have issues with memory. So obviously memories from before, during and after a seizure are most likely lost as the brain was unable to take in information or store it properly at the time. For some people, there is ongoing unusual electrical activity in their brain between seizures, and this too can affect memory and functioning in day-to-day life. Seizures generally are classified into two types, so generalised, meaning the whole brain is involved during the seizure activity, and focal, which is the seizure is taking place in a specific part of the brain. So where in the brain that a seizure takes place will define often the type and level of impact on the memory. So let's have a bit of a look at the brain. Just excuse me while I flick through a couple of slides. This is our brain, and as you can see, the brain is divided into lobes. So we've got the frontal, the parietal, the occipital, and the temporal lobe. Now, this down here, by the way, is the cerebellum and the brainstem. So abnormalities in memory tend to occur because they impact on the temporal lobe and the frontal lobe. These are the two lobes that are particularly concerned with memory. So if your seizures, let's say, start in the temporal lobe here on the left-hand side, and we'll assume this is the left-hand side of the brain, you are likely to have issues with verbal memory because that's what that part of the brain is concerned about, verbal aspects. So you'll have difficulty remembering words and remembering names. If, however, they originate on the right temporal lobe, you may have issues recalling faces and directions. So that is how to get around somewhere. So it's about vision and it's about awareness in space. The frontal lobe here is concerned with planning and the ability to recall a planned action. So you might find it hard to remember what you intended to do, as well as having general issues with organising your thoughts and planning in general. Okay. So let's think of the next one, which is not specifically seizures that occur at night. So while we sleep, the brain is processing what we've absorbed during the day. Regular nocturnal seizures will disrupt this process and thereby impact on memory, but also it impacts on daytime functioning. As discussed earlier, seizures disrupt our sleep patterns, so the individual will be drowsy and tired in the morning and throughout the day, which can reduce the ability to concentrate, to learn, and to create memory, as well as being tired in general. So nocturnal seizures have a particularly challenging impact on memory. The next issue people with epilepsy might face is that of medications. So anti-epileptic medication may contribute to memory issues also. These medications are designed to slow down the speed of the brain, so to reduce that hyperactivity of the brain that occurs during a seizure. So because the brain is slower, it's processing information slower, which means can lead to feelings of fogginess or drowsiness. It can also affect the ability to learn and retain new information and impact on the short-term memory. So each individual response to medication is different, but memory issues are more likely to occur if the dose is high or if someone is taking more than one type of medication. And the impact can actually be worse when you start a new medication, as the body can take some time to adjust. And the last specific factor that impacts on memory for those with epilepsy is surgery. Memory impairments are often reported following epilepsy-related surgery. It's more common with surgery to the temporal lobe. I mean, that being said though, when it comes to surgery, it does actually aim to reduce seizure activity, which improves quality of life, obviously, and possibly may improve memory. And it also reduces medication levels. And both of these can have a positive effect on memory, so that does pay to consider. So what this tells us is that those who experience issues with memory due to circumstances outside the norm, so brain injury, illness, or a chronic condition, indeed have a greater struggle than most. Poor memory can have a large impact on our quality of life. It can result in problems with education, work, relationships, and so on, and it can lead to feelings of anxiety and low self-esteem. But while the factors impacting on memory may not be curable as such, there are definitely tips and compensatory strategies that we can implement that can help you adapt and work around those deficits. So let's have a look at some of the things that you might do to assist you in taking on board, so encoding, storing, and recalling information. So let's start with our first tip, and I'm guessing you can see via the diagram that we're talking about maintaining a healthy lifestyle. So the first thing you can do is exercise regularly. It relieves stress, which we know can limit our ability to take on board new information. It improves blood flow and it carries nutrients and oxygen to the brain, which all helps to optimize its function. Eating a healthy diet is important. It's an essential component of keeping your mind and body healthy. If you can, avoid smoking, alcohol, and other drugs. Certainly alcohol and other drugs can be a trigger for some when it comes to epilepsy and seizures. But all these can lead to negative impacts on the brain and can in turn lead to a worsening in memory. And then we want to seek to manage stress effectively. So stress and distraction will impact on our ability to focus and concentrate. So it means that information may not be taken on board at all, or it may be stored ineffectively. You can, of course, watch the Epilepsy WA stress management seminar that's on our YouTube channel if you want to learn more ways and specific ways of dealing with your stress if that is an issue for you. Okay. Our next tip for improving memory is to be organised. It sounds obvious, but it can be quite complicated in today's busy world. So when it comes to being organised, by being organised, it'll reduce stress and thereby enhance your memory. Secondly, part of organisation is having a set routine. Having a set routine means that you're clear about what to expect each day and it puts less demand on your memory. It can also eliminate that rushing about and that feeling of being overwhelmed, so overwhelming levels of demand, which in turn can result in errors when it comes to memory. We suggest and encourage you to keep a diary or a calendar and to use it regularly. Make sure that this remains in a set place so it's not easily lost. Record not only appointments or events, but include people's names if that's an issue for you. Write down what happened at key events, anything that you think might be useful for you in the future. And speaking of keeping it in a set place, a really helpful motto to live by can be a place for everything and everything in its place. This reduces stress and frees up space in your mind for other information because you know exactly where things are going to be when you need them. And our third tip is to focus and pay attention. So being mindful of paying attention to what is being said or happening in the moment will go a long way to improving your memory. So focusing on particular pieces of information as well that you know are or will be important can be really helpful. And the other thing I really want to encourage you to do is to try and complete just one task at a time. There's that huge catchphrase that it's all everywhere at the moment about multitasking and the benefits of multitasking. This is actually a furphy because it really isn't true that we can do more than one thing at a time. We simply have become more proficient at rapidly switching our focus from one task to another. Multitasking really is simply an illusion. So if information is being shared, try and limit your distractions and give it your full attention. Okay, so let's now consider specific compensatory strategies. So a compensatory strategy is a way of working around an impairment to maximise function. So we may not necessarily be able to change some of the issues that might be promoting issues with memory, but we can work around them and use strategies to make sure that we function to our full capacity. So the first one, which is pretty obvious, I guess, and many of you probably will already use, but they're called memory aids. So different strategies may suit different individuals or types of memory problems, and it may take some time to find what suits you, but it really can be worth the effort. So these aids are designed to remind you or prompt you of things you need to remember. So the first is my favorite, the good old post-it note. These are actually fantastic because they can be placed in various places in your home to remind you of particular events and tasks. So favorite locations people talk about is the bathroom mirror, by the front door, on the fridge, or even in the car rearview mirror if there's something really important that you need to make sure you do or remember before you leave for work. We have talked about calendars and diaries already. And the next is the to-do list. So these are particularly useful for recording daily tasks or when looking to plan large events in the future. It's that time of year again, the good old Christmas list. So a to-do list can be incredibly helpful. Another really useful tool is the pill box or the Dosset box. These are essential actually when helping you to recall medication and when to take it. They can be either, the simple box can be purchased from chemists and which you stock yourself, or your pharmacist can provide you with medication pre-packaged in individual sections that indicate each time of day and what should be taken when. They also remind you of how many to take, and they can actually be really useful if you have difficulty recalling if you took your medication that day. And the lucky last is alarms and mobile phones. Using alarms as reminders can be a really useful prompt when to do something, and the classic, of course, is medication. So setting an alarm for when you need to take your medication. Today's smartphones usually have a more detailed reminder function, so they can provide quite detailed information if you need it. Many also have inbuilt digital voice recorders for you to record your thoughts as they come to hand, to be stored and reviewed at a later date. And there's also now an app for everything, with many insisting they can maximise your organisational and memory skills. So don't hesitate to explore and use some of those. All right, our next compensatory strategy, notice my camels there, is mnemonics. Now, these are a verbal or a visual aid that helps us remember specific information, usually in the form of a rhyme or saying. So, for example, the saying, Richard of York gave battle in vain, can help you to remember the colours of the rainbow by taking the first letters of each word in that statement, which are R, O, Y, G, B, I, V, it gives you the colours of the rainbow in their order: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo and violet. I still remember from music class in primary school being taught every good boy deserves fruit to learn the major scales. So mnemonics can be verbal, so that rhyme or saying, but they can also be visual. And a visual mnemonic generally involves two tasks. So it's about forming a mental image, and then it's about making associations with that image and between those images. So if you have a look at my camels here, we have a Bactrian camel and a dromedary camel. Do you know which is which? Because I can teach you a fabulous strategy to help you remember that. Not that that necessarily is going to be information that you can use, but you never know. Quiz night could be the winning question. Okay, so our Bactrian camel is actually this one here on our left. And the reason that I know that is because Bactrian camels have two humps, and their two humps form a sideways letter B. A camel with one hump is known as a dromedary camel. And as you can see, the single hump forms a sideways letter D. I think that's fabulous. There's also, to remember your elephants, an African elephant's ears are large and shaped like Africa, while an Asian elephant's ears are small and shaped like India. So we're again making a visual connection between these mental images to help us remember. Another technique that you might like to try is, and I think it's even actually mentioned in Sherlock Holmes books and movies, is to visualize putting things in a room. So, but the key to this room is it needs to be a room in your own house. So this is really important that it is your house, because your house layout is already imprinted in your long-term memory. It's there and it's not likely to be erased. So by adding a new item or a new feature to that particular memory, it's providing easy access to that long-term memory and making it more likely that we can access that information in the future. So this works, for example, by visualizing the item or the information that you want to remember, say, for example, as a painting on the wall in one of the rooms, or see yourself in a room putting that particular object in a particular drawer. And that way, when it's time to recall the memory, if you reconnect with the memory of that room, hopefully then it'll actually trigger the memory as to where that object is, or as to the information that you want to remember. Okay. So let's now have a think about some specific techniques for those common areas of deficit, those issues that people frequently report. So the first one is remembering where you put something. Now, these might seem really obvious, but sometimes it's the obvious things that we forget, and we think that the answer is far more complex than it actually needs to be. So firstly, if you know it's an issue, when you're placing an item down, watch yourself doing it. So be present, as we've talked about a lot in this presentation, and then say out loud, I am putting the remote control in the drawer. Be in the moment, focus and concentrate. You might want to have a book in which you list all those special places that each item should be in. I don't know how many times I have put something in a safe place, only when it comes time for me to remember where it is to have totally forgotten where that safe place was. That safe place is so safe, it's even safe from me, sadly. But I'm using a book and popping in there where you're putting important things, particularly if you know you're going to need them at a later date. So you might want to write yourself a reminder that the receipts for tax time are in the shoebox that's in the study closet, or what have you. If you can't locate an item, try and recall what you were doing the last time you saw it or you used that item. Sometimes physically going back to that spot can help jog your memory. It's funny, we talked earlier about walking into a room and forgetting why you were there. Very often going back to the place where you were when you had the original thought of going to that room can be enough to jog memory. Go, oh, that's right, I was looking for whatever it was. And lastly, when creating a space for something, create a link between the object and where you're putting it. So, for example, keep your car keys by the door, or store items related to work in or near your desk. Give yourself as many prompts as you can to help you locate that information. Okay, another one, and I have to confess this is a real issue with me, is remembering someone's name. And can I just draw your attention to that meme, because I think it's absolutely fabulous. So how can we help ourselves recall names? Firstly, when you meet someone for the first time, concentrate on their name, repeat it to yourself, and use it frequently when talking to them. This gives a chance for memory to be laid down, not just in terms of repetition, but as you use their name and engage with them more often, there's a chance that you are going to develop some kind of association between them and in their name. So use it as often as you can. And if you are introduced to a number of people, make an excuse to repeat their names back. So you might say, let me just make sure I've got your names right, and run through them again. And that's a nice way to, if you have had a bit of an error in that encoding of the information, it's a good way for it to be corrected so that we don't have incorrect learning starting to take place. Another thing you can do is to link the names of the person with something that reminds you of them. So it might be a rhyme, it might be a physical characteristic, or some kind of visualization. So for example, if Joan's a moaner, you might say to yourself, Joan always moans. If Mr. Pearman, gee, by chance, just happens to be shaped like a pear, that's a very nice association to make to help you remember his name. Or you might want to visualize Brian sitting on top of a brain, if that's helpful for you. It can be really helpful to write the name down on paper or on your phone and try to commit it to memory later. I've certainly started doing that with fellow colleagues in the building who work for charities that we share the space with. I've actually now got a list of agencies and people's names to help me remember. And lastly, if in the moment, again, try that technique of running through the alphabet to see if a letter triggers the memory of their name. All right. So now I want to focus on how strategies you can use to help you remember to do something. So obviously leaving items near the door to prompt you when you have to go to leave for the day. And as I said earlier, often the key to memory is organisation. So being organised, taking the time to do things in advance to reduce the likelihood of stress later. Use your mobile phone to alert you to upcoming events or items to be addressed, as we've discussed. And this is a really good point. If possible, complete a task as soon as it comes to hand or as soon as it comes to mind. Don't put it off. The longer we put things off, the far more likely we are to forget something. Another great strategy is if you know you're prone to forgetting things such as locking the door, as you undertake the task, say out loud, I'm locking the door, or watch yourself do it. I know for me, using the lock function on my key ring, I can never remember whether or not I've done it. So I've actually taken to paying attention, picking up my keys and saying, I'm locking the door. And that saves me having to then sit there and fret for the next 20 minutes at work going, did I lock the car door, did I not? And sometimes even having to go back to check to reduce my anxiety so I can actually focus on the tasks at hand. Okay, and lucky last, and this again is pretty obvious, but it again doesn't hurt to state the obvious sometimes. When it comes to remembering messages, write them down. It's the most practical and easy way to do this. When you're trying to remember numbers, group them together. So for example, if you need to remember the numbers 247, it can either be remembered as 247 if that's easier for you, or find a meaning for the numbers. So if luck would have it, the 24th of July or the 24th of the 7th could be someone's birthday. One thing I do is to create a rhythm to help remember a phone number. So you can see here our office phone. And so I might go 64577699, 64577699. And for me, establishing a rhythm actually helps me to, when I remember the rhythm, I remember the number. And lastly, if you know you've forgotten a message, try to work out the details around it. So think about who gave you the message, where were you at the time, what time of day it was, what were you doing at the time. And any of these can sometimes prompt your memory and bring the message to the fore. So work around the issue and see if that gives you some help as well. That's the last of our strategies. I hope that's been really useful. So let's refresh our memories and in conclusion, review what we've learned today. So the first thing is that memory is our ability to encode, store, and recall information. And we do this, that there is 3 types of memory. And remember that this is the linear process we talk about. We get information, it goes into the sensory memory, is then hopefully, if it's important, moves to the short-term or working memory, and then will transition into the long-term memory. There are a number of factors that can have impacts on memory in general, but epilepsy itself can have a significant impact on memory and in some very unique ways. I also want you to remember that everybody forgets. So busyness, the busyness of everyday life, distractions all get in the way. But it's about how can we use certain strategies. And these are two ways. We maximize our memory by maintaining a healthy lifestyle, being present, so important, and being organized. And secondly, we can then use compensatory strategies to assist us if we know we have a particular area of weakness. Hello again. I hope you found that presentation useful. It's been my pleasure to share it with you. If you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch via email. We can be reached at community@epilepsywa.asn.au. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you've enjoyed the presentation. Bye-bye.